When conflict erupts in one part of the world, this affects travel far beyond borders. Markets react, oil prices move, airspaces close, and suddenly something most people take for granted, the ability to get on a plane and go home, becomes deeply uncertain. On the 28th of February 2026, escalating conflict between Israel, the US, and Iran brought parts of Middle Eastern airspace to a standstill. Flights were diverted, airports emptied, and hundreds of thousands of travelers were stranded. For the travel industry, it became a race against time. For travelers, it became a lesson in how quickly certainty can disappear. Welcome to Everything Counts. In this bi-weekly podcast series, we're frank about money and the discussions we should all be having. I'm Motheo Khoaripe, and today we're looking at what happens when global events collide with human reality. Joining me is Paolo Giuricich, head of Investec Travel, and Otto de Vries, the CEO of the Association of Southern African Travel Advisors, better known as ASATA. Paolo, if you can just take us through, the first few hours of that experience, what exactly happened operationally when the airspaces started to close?
Well, before we even talk about the airspace actually closing, we need to talk about lots of aeroplanes in the sky dotting across the world from point to point. And depending on where those aircraft actually were at a particular point in time, indicated what would happen at scale in terms of diversions, etc. So take, for example, an aircraft is on its way to Dubai or Doha. It has an hour to land in. That has a very different outcome to a flight that's just taken off from Johannesburg, for example. So the aircraft that were landing had to be diverted, and likely they were diverted to Oman, to Muscat, or to Saudi Arabia, likely Riyadh. Those that were closer to home got turned around and sent back.
You make it sound seamless and orderly, but I would imagine it was a lot of chaos then, having to control that kind of change, especially mid-air.
Yeah, especially for passengers who think they are going somewhere.
Yeah.
And suddenly they're not. They might be going to a different destination. They may be going home. So it has an implication operationally on airlines, the scale of which is not really understood by the average person.
Otto, I'd like to bring you in here on how significant those hubs were in terms of that particular event, right? The likes of Doha, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, they connect the rest of the world. So when something like this happens in that central point, what does it look like and how does it affect those commercial airlines?
Exactly right. I mean, Emirates is the second largest airline in the world. And the whole model around Emirates, Qatar, is a hub and spoke model, which means that the whole way that business has been structured is to move people from different parts of the world to other parts of the world. And in the absence of a national carrier, in the case of South Africa, where that vacuum appeared, airlines like Emirates and Qatar in particular, and to be fair, Etihad as well, started to fill that vacuum. And over the years has built up and has grown a phenomenal sort of footprint, if you will, in terms of airline capacity. And many South Africans gravitated to those carriers. They have an excellent product. They came in with really good pricing and they were able to scale and make sure that South Africans had access to the world. So the impact for South Africans was phenomenal. To give you just a sense of just how big that is, on the 28th of February, we had a scenario where ostensibly the three major desert carriers collectively out of the three major South African centers were delivering up to 98 flights a week. And if you look at an airline like Emirates, sometimes one, if not two of those 3 or 4 flights out of Johannesburg are Airbus A380s. So when you start to do the maths, you start to get a sheer sense of the implications and the fallout and the impact that it had on the travel industry. And of course, the travelers as a result of the immediate closing of that airspace.
And also there's a lot of work that then goes into making sure that firstly everyone's safe, but things run smoothly. So how do you handle that in the background? What do we not see as travelers as we sit there, biting our fingernails or wanting to go home?
Well, it depends on where you are. And we spoke about the hub and spoke scenario. So if you were in Dubai, that could have been possibly quite scary, and as well as Doha and Abu Dhabi. Whereas if you were an hour out, you were suddenly being diverted. You were still potentially in a broader war zone collectively around that region. And if you had just taken off with the ambition that you were either on your way home or you were about to head off on a holiday or a work trip, suddenly that is altered immediately. So depending on where you are, depends on what happens next. The key intent at that moment from a travel industry perspective is to ensure that the passengers are safe, that they are taken care of. And in that case, our partners, in this case, the airlines, would have been very proactive in facilitating the situation, specifically if it was out of country. In country, we would have had a lot more involvement with the travel advisors and those that had facilitated the travel, where we would be looking to, first of all, understand the extent of the problem, and then to make sure that we do our level best to try and either repatriate those that we wish to get home, or we have to try to find ways to reroute those passengers who still wish to travel. But that airspace, when it closes, becomes really, really challenging.
From what I'm getting from what you're saying is that safety in this case would trump convenience. So it doesn't matter where you were going, doesn't matter if you are about to board a flight. So how do you balance that as a service provider within an airport to say, okay, we need to make sure you're safe, but at the same time, give you assurances that you're going to be okay and there's a plan in place?
Well, I think if you're in the region, the supplier of the service, and in this case, the airlines, took immediate action to support and assist the passengers that were impacted and effectively stranded. We know that Emirates did a phenomenal job in accommodating guests, passengers in hotels in and around the airport. And as things were possible in terms of repatriation and where they had aircraft available, they started to repatriate and do their level best to either move passengers on or get them back home.
And I think one of the other things was also the airlines had really flexible policies, which allowed us to be able to make alternative arrangements for clients. Obviously, not the ones specifically that was stuck in the Middle East region, but those stuck anywhere else around the world or needed to get out of South Africa. We could put them on different airlines. We could facilitate that abrasion in the system at the particular point in time, which really comes down to the relationships that we had with those airlines and their great policies. And I guess the time frame was unknown, and that makes a big difference, because some people could say, well, look, I don't need to travel. Other people will say, actually, I have to get to travel. I've got to get to a meeting. I've got a family event. Help me.
This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. In 2025, all three countries had gone into the same situation. It just didn't escalate. How did you handle it then?
So to give you context, in June 2025, when Israel struck Iran through bombings, it was a very short period of time. We saw very limited impact on airspace closures during that time, except for about 7 hours in Doha, specifically because there was a retaliatory attack by Iran onto the airbase in Qatar, the US airbase in Qatar. So when this crisis started, we thought a similar pattern would emerge. And when we saw the closure of airspace, we thought it's going to be a few hours. Let's just pace ourselves and see what happens. That obviously turned into days, weeks, and months.
I want to know the work that you and the team did in trying to make sure and maybe finding out which of your clients were out there and how you could help them. How did that process go?
Yes, I suppose if you think about what the playbook really is for this type of scenario, or any scenario in travel, is we immediately go and pull lists of clients to understand who's traveling, who's in journey, who is departing perhaps today, who is arriving in a particular destination which may be of concern, etc. And once we have all those identified travelers, we then start a proactive outreach to each of those clients. Normally, when there are disruptions in travel, clients phone us. That's what normally happens, but this was different. We knew that this was going to be something that had an abrasive nature to it and a safety aspect, which is not really contemplatable by the traveler at a particular point in time. So we decided to reach out proactively to each of those clients. And what we did was we called the team in immediately, we split the work up, and we started phoning primarily. If we couldn't get hold of somebody, we dropped them an email immediately.
Otto, handling that kind of chaos in real time is not really easy. As an association, how do you remedy a situation like this in trying to make sure there's connection between, third-party service providers, there's connection between the commercial airlines and also travelers?
At that point in time, what we do is we assess the situation, we monitor it, and we allow the stakeholders to get on with the job of mitigating and managing the crisis. As time went by, it became evident that this was going to be a lot longer than a few hours or a few days. then the playbook starts to shift. And then you start to become a little bit more proactive in terms of, okay, as an industry body, what and how can we support the sector when there's so many moving parts? So the operational aspect is now being managed on an operational level, but we need to start to understand a number of other areas that are going to have implications. So we started to engage with our legal counsel to understand very simple basics like who's responsible. What happens if there's a cancellation? What happens if there's a need for a refund? Where does the money sit? How does that money flow get impacted in terms of making sure that the customer and their funds are protected?
Yeah.
Along comes insurance. And so we go on and on and on. And then we also speak to the airlines and we start to get a better understanding of how they've set up their crisis centers and how they are intentionally and proactively working together with the trade.
How important are those relationships to make sure that things were seamless?
So the relationships were everything in this crisis and always are in general in business. But in this particular case, what we found is that because of the unknown scenarios, and we were planning for worst case, we had to almost make calls before airlines actually could provide us with official policy. But the difference here was that we were able to speak to people that could guide us even before those policies were issued. So to give an example, we have great relationships with our Qatar Airways and Emirates colleagues, and we're on WhatsApp with them. And the level of communication back to us as what we are called the trade was incredible.
Looking at that particular situation, I'm thinking about the team and how you had to handle this particular crisis. Just tell us, amount of pressure you are under, because as someone who's a client, I'm thinking I want to feel like I'm the only one being served. Are my best interests being carried out by, my advisors? So just the pressure you handled as a team.
Yeah, so I think, the interesting thing is it started on a weekend. During any after-hours scenario, we always have at least 2 people available to our clients to provide that level of comfort, safety, and help with anything that may happen with their travel. And what we did was we brought in the whole team, I'd say probably 80% of the team on board. And what we were doing was going through these lists proactively to reach out to clients. But the 2 people answering the phones on the after-hours emergency line became completely overwhelmed because the calls were coming through. So what they were doing was they were picking up a call, and any missed call, they would pop the number onto a Teams group and somebody else would pick it up and call. And then by the end of the day, we'd actually opened our entire travel call center, so that it wasn't just 2 people.
Otto, on this particular podcast, Everything Counts, we've discussed the importance of travel insurance. And when you travel, you want to know that you covered, but this was extraordinary circumstances where it became a force majeure and some rules were thrown out the window.
Look, I wanted to start off by saying that travel insurance shouldn't be something that you forget to do or think, oh, I don't need it, or give it the due consideration that it deserves and the value that it offers. Travel insurance is a critical part of every booking that you make, whether you are booking through a travel advisor or whether you're booking yourself directly. We often hear stories, oh, but my credit card gives me cover. But have you really looked to make sure that you understand exactly what is so-called covered with no charge? And this particular instance, I think it's important to frame it in the way that it is, because the situation quickly was identified and defined as a state of war. In that scenario, the cover in terms of changing your travel arrangements are not covered by your policy. However, a travel policy covers a number of different items, and you can choose the type of policy package that you want, but not least of which, and the ones that is probably the most critical, is based on medical requirements. Medical claims outstrip all other claims pertaining to travel insurance by a country mile. One of our largest insurers advised us that between 70 to 80% of claims on travel insurance is based on medical requirements. This in itself says that whilst the force majeure is in place, the value of the travel insurance extends beyond the immediate, and that insurance kicks in immediately to facilitate any other aspect other than the force majeure scenario.
And Paolo, that makes the case then for comprehensive travel insurance, right? Because you often think of a cancelled flight or something perhaps going a little bit wrong in our travel, but not really the circumstances where you find yourself in a dire position.
Absolutely. Until you're in a particular situation and understand the abrasion that could exist and ultimately the cost of something happening, you have to have the travel insurance. But I just want to make it a little bit more practical in terms of what this force majeure actually means, because Otto said a policy is very comprehensive. So, for example, if there's an exclusion because of force majeure and something happens to you in countries, so for example, you get sick, you are still covered for that medical condition specifically. But unfortunately, if you were injured because of a war, you may not be covered. And I think that distinction just needs to be very, very clear.
It's been a fascinating conversation so far. When we come back, we'll hear in more detail about one Investec Travel client who found herself stranded in Doha with her husband and young son and what it took to get them home.
A card as international as you are. Your Investec private bank account is multi-currency enabled and tailor-made for you. A single account, one card, 4 currencies, unlimited rewards. Easy, seamless, intuitive. Whatever kind of person you are and whatever your international needs may be, your Investec private bank account is multi-currency enabled and tailor-made for you.
Welcome back to Everything Counts. We're still in conversation with Head of Investec Travel, Paolo Giuricich, and Otto de Vries, the CEO of the Association of Southern African Travel Advisors, better known as ASATA. When we look at, these headlines and we read the news that there's major airports being closed down, travelers not knowing what to do, we never really think about the families and faces that are affected. Paolo, you've also shared the story with us of one particular family whose ordeal stayed with you long after the crisis had ended. Just tell us more about their experience.
Yes, certainly. So this is a story that's quite close to my heart because I actually picked up the first call and spoke to this client when we did finally get in touch with him. But just to sketch the context, we had our client with her husband and young son who had left for Doha 3 days before the war started and were about to travel to London for the balance of their holiday. So effectively they were stuck in Doha as the airspace closed, and we could not get hold of them initially through the phone, as I'm not sure that they had international roaming. And so we dropped them an email immediately to say that we try to get hold of them, to support them in any way that we could. And within a few minutes, they'd responded back, sent me a number which we could call them on, and we had our first interaction with the clients. At that point, we knew nothing. We knew what was on CNN, that the airspace had closed. We had no official communication from the airlines, and that first conversation really catalyzed a relationship that would span and continue till today.
I can't imagine what they were going through emotionally, right? Because you don't know what's happening in the next hour. So how did you deal with that to say, okay, you're with your family, you feel quite vulnerable at this moment, but here's what's coming next?
Things that happened during the time of this crisis were things that weren't known to people before. So to give you an example, air raid warnings were signaled on the client's cell phones. And the first air raid warning that they heard was while they were at the beach. But it wasn't their phones only. Everybody's phones around them had the signal, and nobody really knew what was going on. So people packed up their belongings from the beach and ran back to the hotels. And I think that was something that people then discovered meant incoming attacks. And so having these constant alerts going off creates a level of anxiety and stress that really you and I probably can't conceptualize because we've never been in that position. So the client's stress and anxiety was really a core piece of what we thought we needed to help manage, because we were the only people on the other end of the call, on the other end of the line. And so we were there to listen. We were there to provide information to help lower that anxiety and stress, and just to keep in contact every single day so that they knew we had their backs.
Otto, how important is it to see then the relationships here between the hotels, the accommodation side of the business, as well as the transport businesses, the commercial airlines to say, look, we know that we don't have any flights today, but we can accommodate you, and this is what we're willing to do?
Look, I think relationships matter, full stop. And in a time of crisis like this, where those relationships really start to pay off. And you can imagine that in the scenario that we've been discussing today, it is because of the relationships that those carriers have in market, in their home base markets, and their ability to also leverage those, because a big part of what, for example, Qatar and Emirates offer is these stopover packages. So they are in direct contact with these suppliers. They have access to content. And it would also be very evident at that very moment that no new customers are coming in either, right? So there is the real reality of available capacity to try and support at that particular moment. So relationships are critical, and the value chain engages in a very collaborative manner in most cases, certainly when we have a crisis.
Paolo, then when you get these calls, I imagine the frequently asked question is, when is the next flight? In the background, with your team, what are you working out, and how are you finding out when the next flight is, and working out schedules for the clients?
So we were, monitoring flight radar 24 the whole time to see if there was movement, and there was no movement. There was absolutely nothing. One other method that we used was to look at what we call the global distribution systems to identify if there's inventory, because generally an indication of inventory for flights means that there's a chance that the flights might take off. So in the first few days, there was inventory for the next day all the time. So what we were doing was constantly rebooking clients' tickets, assuming that they would get out the next day. But after 2 or 3 days, we started to realize that was not the case. The flights were simply being cancelled. And then what we saw was something very scary. We saw the airlines remove inventory from the system. We couldn't even book a flight. And I think they realized that this was going to be prolonged and there was nothing much that could be done. After about 8 days, we were sitting in the office. It was a Friday afternoon. We were like, what are we going to do? So we decided to have a Teams call with them. Again, part of the daily check-in, but this was a face-to-face effectively through MS Teams. And the visible expression of stress and anxiety on the client's face was notable. On Saturday morning, we checked in just to see, and Sunday, we did the same thing again. And Sunday afternoon, I was feeling really, really tired. It had been 8 or 9 days now, and I decided to go try and nap on Sunday afternoon. So I went to my bed, and as one does when one lies on your bed, you whip out your phone and just check one last time to see that if there's anything. And I saw on socials that there was the potential of a flight from Doha to London.
And this presented a chance, of course.
And it presented a chance, but we had no official guidance from the airlines. So I literally jumped up and went to my computer, logged onto the system, and I saw this flight to London. And so I booked it immediately. And I called the clients and said, look, I don't want to get your hopes up, but there's a flight, and there'd be nothing listed. So there was a flight, booked it, and sent the information to the client. They were super excited and happy.
At what point do you know that it's absolutely happening?
That's an interesting question. We had no idea whether this flight would actually go or not. But what we did was we provided the client with hope that something would happen, some movement would happen, and they would actually be on their way. We got pictures of them smiling, happy in the check-in queue for the flight, and happy to be finally leaving. And then silence.
What kind of silence? Because I'm on the edge of my seat thinking this movie script is playing itself out.
Well, we made an assumption on the silence that they'd gone out of cell phone signal. We assumed that they boarded. We had flight radar open, and I watched anxiously on flight radar as that flight took off, and it passed into Qatari airspace and turned towards London. And the lift sense was they have to be on that aircraft. We were suddenly the ones with hope that they had to be on that aircraft. And eventually, when they landed in London and they were back in signal, we got the message.
I can only imagine the relief, for the team as well.
Well, this was now almost 5 p.m. in the afternoon. And, we just did a little dance. We were actually quite emotional.
Yeah,
that the clients had actually finally made it,
holding their hand throughout the entire experience,
and we got them out.
Otto, from an industry perspective, watching this play out and seeing the many solutions that came through at a time of crisis, what would you say is important for travelers and clients to remember when things like this happen?
Well, to start off with, while booking travel may have become easier, traveling itself has become considerably more complicated. The world our clients are traveling through today, it's complex and more so now than at any other point in recent history. And at the same time, travelers are facing an overwhelming amount of information. There's just hundreds of websites. There's multiple booking channels. You've got dynamic pricing. You've got ancillary products. You've got loyalty programs. You've got changing entry requirements, insurance options, health requirements. So it's becoming increasingly complex out there. And so, I think what we're seeing is that working with a travel advisor is not just about we can book this trip for you. It's about we can help you make the right decisions. So if you think about what the business of being a travel advisor is actually today, we advise on visas, we advise on travel documentation, we advise on destination requirements, we manage duty of care obligations, we assist during disruptions, we provide risk management, we help travelers navigate insurance options, we manage changes, and we solve problems.
This was a particular stress test for the industry. What do you think are the key lessons that a lot of the commercial carriers took away from this?
Well, I think they would have learned from what had already been put into the playbook around what we experienced with COVID. The fact that for all intents and purposes, whilst on a personal level, it can be extremely painful and stressful for those that are impacted by it. If you look back on what happened, there are probably a few small additional tweaks that needs to be considered, as this wasn't a pandemic, it was a war situation. But I think that the playbook will continue to refine itself and get better in terms of ensuring that the customer and the anxiety and the stress and the challenges that come with it are managed to the best of everybody's ability with the limited capacities and or possibilities that are created as a result of whatever the event may be.
Paolo, for you, what stayed with you the most from this particular experience?
Well, one of the things that we did was once our clients were safely back in South Africa, we actually brought them in to meet them face to face because we hadn't yet met them, to have lunch with them, and to run a small panel discussion with our broader team in travel. Because what we felt was really important was for our team to understand the significant impact that we have on clients. And that's a really unique thing because we generally don't see our clients. They're behind an email, they're behind a phone call, and to actually understand the complexity of the relationship and the ability to show empathy and build the relationship in a way is really good to see. And in order to repeat that behavior going forward with other clients, it's important that we needed to debrief that. So that was really an important milestone, I would say, to have the client come in and talk to us. But there was a quote, and I want to quote what our client said at the end of the session that we had.
Yeah.
Our client said, "Now we know our lives matter not only to ourselves, our family, friends, and colleagues, but also to Investec." And that to me was an incredible closing statement from our client. And above this is where we really demonstrated our values. You build an emotional connection with clients during moments like these. That's something you don't get through a normal banking product. It's also a reminder that being deeply invested in our clients is not just a slogan. It's a behavior that extends organically from our organization's culture, purpose, and set of values.
This has been a very fascinating conversation, and I'm hoping that you enjoyed it as much as we did here on Everything Counts. Thank you to Paolo and Otto. If there's one thing to take away from this particular conversation, it's this: travel is easy when everything works. The real value is revealed when everything breaks. Now, in moments of crisis, people remember who answered the phone, and sometimes being deeply invested means much more than money.
The views expressed are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily represent the views of the firm and should not be taken as advice or recommendations. Investec Private Banking, a division of Investec Bank Limited, a registered credit provider committed to the Code of Banking Practice as regulated by the National Financial Ombudsman.